We're going to focus on that first phrase, who, though he was in the form of God. Though he was in the form of God. Now, when we use the term form, we are typically thinking of external shape or appearance. Third, fourth grade science, you learn that liquid takes the shape, takes the form of its container. Right? So if you have water and you pour it into a glass, it takes the shape of that cylinder. If you put it in a box, it takes the shape of a rectangle or a cube. Right? That's common. That's how we think of form. We think of clothes as form-fitting. Right? Sometimes that's good, sometimes not so good, right? But that's what we mean. When we think form, we think the outer shape of something. That is not what the Bible means by form. All right? That is not what form means here in Philippians 2, verse 6, or in verse 8. That is so important for us to know. The word form here is morphe in the Greek, which means substance or nature or essence. All right? When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, it metamorphoses, right? We get that word morphe that's in there. Now, when that butterfly comes out, you don't say, well, look at that caterpillar with wings. Right? You don't know. It's a butterfly. It has changed. It was a caterpillar. Now it's a butterfly. It is something else in substance. That's what what morphe is getting at. Now don't take that and say, Matt said when Jesus became man, he became something different. That's not what I'm saying. Jesus does not metamorphose. He doesn't metamorphosize. Right? He does not. We're going to see that. The point of that illustration is to say morphe means essence or nature, the inner being, not simply the external appearance. So we could read verse 6 this way. Though Jesus was by very nature God. He was by nature, in essence, in who he is, God. Jesus is and always was and always will be God. Right? John 1:1 confirms this. Speaking of Jesus, John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When John says word, logos, he is speaking of Jesus. Jesus was, and is, and always will be God. Now, though, in verse 6, though he was in the form of God, that does not negate his divinity. He's not about to say, though he was in the form of God, then he became something else. Though he was in the form of God is an interjection that Paul uses here to say Jesus was equal with God because he was God. Right? He's not negating his divinity here. He's about to amplify his humility. The next part of verse 6 only makes sense if that's true. Right? So let's look at that. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, now if we just skip that interjection, we would say this, who did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, if he's not God, well, that's the most obvious statement in all the world. Right? If he's not God, of course he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's why he says, though he was in the form of God, he was God, and did not count equality with a thing to be grasped. That's what makes that sentence striking. That's what makes that sentence make sense. But he is God, and so his grasping or exploiting his rights as God is what is in view here. When it says he does not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, what he's saying is here is that Jesus refused to take advantage of his rights as God for himself. Matthew 26:53 might be the most clear example of this. From the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas comes and kisses him on the cheek. Peter draws his little dagger and cuts off the servant's ear. Jesus puts it back on, and what does he turn around and tell Peter? He turns around and tells Peter, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" If I needed to, Peter, I could have 12 legions, 120,000 angels come and disperse this little rabble. Right? But he doesn't. He does not take advantage of his status and rights and his divinity for himself. He did not count his godness, his divinity, as something to be used for his own advantage. That's what verse 6 is getting at. He is God, but he did not take advantage of that for himself. What did he do instead? Verse 7. But, so au contraire, right? Instead of taking advantage of his godness, he emptied himself. All right, now we're going to stop right here. We're going to see in the coming verses how he emptied himself. But we need to say something here about this word, about empty himself, because it is the root of many heresies throughout church history. The text tells us how he does this, but we need to say first off that this does not become, when he empties himself here, this does not mean that he became less than God, that he poured out his godness, that he divested himself of his godness. This text is not teaching us that Jesus somehow arrested his divinity, or put it away. He doesn't stop being God. The self-emptying of Christ, listen, is about his status, not his substance. Right? Though he was in the form of God. His substance is God. He is God. When he empties himself, he doesn't stop being God. Otherwise, what Paul just said, he would be contradicting himself. He was, by nature, God. He's still God. He empties himself. That's true. But he doesn't empty himself of his substance. The self-emptying of Christ is more about his divine rights than his divinity. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. I hope so. All right, so how? How do you do this? What does it mean then if it's not he stopped being God? Well, verse 7. Verse 7 tells us. But emptied himself by. Well, that's the first clip. Okay, well, here's how he emptied himself. By taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. By taking the form, morphe again, the substance, the nature, the essence of man. Now I said of a servant. Now I said earlier this is so important because the opposite theory or the opposite heresy of Jesus not being God anymore was that he was not fully human. Right? Our brains are just trying to figure out this 200% thing. Right? And so we have these heresies that arise from this word in this passage. We affirm that he took on the nature and substance of a man. He became, and not just a man, right? A bondslave, a servant. And he was born in the likeness of men. That's where you get appearance from. Like he looked like a baby because he was one, right? What we're seeing here is what theologians call the hypostatic union. I spelled that on my Facebook status yesterday. Y'all need some help. Look it up. Right there. Hypostatic union. That's just a funny or a complex term with a simple meaning. Jesus is both 100% God and 100% man. He is by nature, in form and substance, 100% God and 100% man. Can we just agree that we're not going to understand how that works? Right? We don't. My brain, like I teach percent at Christ Church Academy and dealing with percent. Like I can't make my brain compute 200% in a 100% situation. Right? I can at the dinner table. I ate 200% of what I needed to eat. Right? But in this situation, like my finite human brain can't compute that. But that's what makes Jesus different. Right? That's what makes him the God-man. And so, in the flow of Paul's argument, what we see is that Jesus is fully God, and yet he emptied himself by taking on humanity, and not just any type of human, but a servant, a bondslave. Not the one who's owed a debt, or not the one who is owed a debt, but the one who owes the debt. Right? Yeah. The King of heaven did not come as a king on earth. No, he came as the lowest, the bondslave, the servant. Now, Jesus would have been well within his rights to come down to earth as a fully grown man, a la Adam, right? Like we agree Adam wasn't created a baby, right? Like he was created a fully grown, like Jesus could have done that. Like he could have just like rent the heavens open, stepped in. Marvel fans, you're gonna like this all week. I've been thinking about Loki. Like, he just comes in and is like, I am God, worship me. Like Jesus could have done that. He could have come in, wiped out all the worst of the evildoers, set up his throne in Jerusalem, and commanded everyone everywhere to worship him. He could have done it that way. But he didn't. Instead, he comes as a baby who is dependent on his teenage mom, who then has to grow in wisdom and stature. The king of the universe has to be a kid. Imagine him just running around the temple. Like, don't run in church. I'm sure they were saying it. They got it. God had been saying it. We don't run in the temple. He takes on humanity and all that means. So, just to further illustrate this, you've heard of addition by subtraction, right? Where maybe a girl breaks up with a worthless dude and then she just flourishes after that. You're like, that's an addition by subtraction. She got rid of this dude who was holding her back. Now look at it. It goes the other way too, right? Or maybe a company fires somebody and morale goes up, company takes off. That person was holding them down. Addition by subtraction.